Welcome to the Red Light Exposé podcast.
We are an international grassroots survivor-led circle.
Our goal is to counter the growing acceptance of sex work ideology.
We aim to raise awareness of the harms of commercializing sex,
meaning prostitution, porn, stripping, and BDSM.
Through honest, in-depth conversations,
we elevate voices often ignored and silenced.
Together, we're challenging stereotypes and dismantling myths.
We envision a healthier, safer society, especially for women and girls.
We appreciate your company on this journey. Welcome back to the Red Light Exposé podcast. My name is Ellie Arrow. I'm an activist against sexual exploitation in Germany. I've been looking into this subject for 8 years. The other voice you're going to hear in this conversation is Andrea Hines, who is exited from 7 years of prostitution in Canada and who's been an advocate for women and girls affected by the industry ever since. The conversation you're going to hear is a part 2 to a discussion that we had last week. Last week we talked about what makes prostitution unsafe, what the dangers are, and why they're inherent. No matter what the law is, there are significant risks to women's physical and emotional safety. In this episode, we are going to talk about concrete measures that are taken to make women safer in prostitution. Things like security cameras, client lists, safety buttons, right? Alarm buttons. And we'll talk about how effective we think they are. You should be able to follow this conversation without part 1. But if getting a more general idea of what the threats are and why they're so hard to remove is interesting to you, then make sure to go back. Otherwise, let's get into the episode.
So we just discussed a way that people imagine under legalization, the state keeps women safer. That piece of plastic is going to do nothing. Worst case scenario could actually help out her. There's concerns with data safety. Who can look into the database where you're registered as a prostitute that you might not want your community or whomever to know? And also you're carrying around identification, which, plenty of shady people that you encounter, you might not want them to know your real name. I think in Germany, you can put your so-called working name on the prostitute's license. That brings us into the first one. What do women do for their safety? They create a pseudonym.
An alter ego, all those things, yeah.
Or potentially multiple, because when you're known by one name, sometimes women start advertising under a new one when they're no longer considered fresh meat.
Or have stalkers.
Yes, and excuse the language. That's not my choice of language. That's, taking from some John forums. But yeah, the first part is nobody works under their real name. And I heard many women say it has the dual purpose of, in my real life, I'm, in your case, Andrea, but when I go in, I'm someone else. And if I use that different name, I also feel like it helps with the process of dissociation that we discussed earlier, but it's also just flat out safety. Don't want any of these men to know what my real name is. Don't want them to look me up on Facebook or wherever, find where I live with my kids, etc., because that could be, hugely dangerous. I fundamentally heavily mistrust my so-called clientele.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's a huge thing too, right? Because when these men are investing money and when they're getting that chemical bonding that occurs through sex that you desire with someone else, then there's that, I want to know more about you. And I remember I used to tell men that my name was Angela whenever they would pester. What's your name? What's your name? Who are you? I know your name's not Kendra. What's your name? I finally started saying Angela because it was close enough to my name that I could remember. And then, it was the same consistent name. And you just see them like, I don't even know how to say like what their response was, but they were just ecstatic that they had some piece of information about me that wasn't in my advertisements, that wasn't public on the John forums, and made them feel like they were somebody special. And I remember thinking to myself, well, that way, if anyone calls me Andrea in public, then they might just think, oh, I heard the wrong name, right? I thought she said her name was Angela, but maybe I heard it wrong. It must have been Andrea. It's all these like safeguarding things all the time of like you said, I can't trust these men, but I'm in close proximity to them. I have to give them this feeling of authenticity and this experience of everything that they think that this should be, but I can't actually do that for my safety. you're looking over your shoulder. Like my city has about 1 million people in it in the metropolitan and surrounding areas, but it's still got that small town vibe. Like I would, and I still do 11 years later, run into sex buyers all the time at grocery stores, indoor playgrounds with my kids. They're everywhere. And so, it also leads a lot of women into isolation because so often I was like, the only people I'm encountering and dealing with in my daily life are sex buyers and occasionally other sex sellers. And that's it. That was my entire work life, if you want to call it that. So, it's, this hypervigilance, but this like continued submersion in there, the mixture of dissociation, trying to tell yourself you're empowered. It's such a cocktail of a mind fuck, really, that, it's no wonder that so many of us leave the industry so, I don't want to say broken, because I don't think any women are broken, but like so discombobulated where we just don't know who we are. Like for so long I was Kendra that I really never did feel like Andrea, because even whenever I'd leave the brothel and I'd go home, I'd be emailing these Johns, I'd be setting up appointments with them, I'd be doing photo shoots for my website, all this stuff that put me back into being Kendra. So there was this merging and mixing of my identity and ultimately a loss of it.
So moving on to another popular proposed method of making women safe that people say, you need legalization for, even though funnily enough, I actually hear way more about it in places with prohibition like the US, is actually the method of screening, which we have to specify what that means. So trying to get as much information on the guy as possible, his real name, maybe a photo of his ID. So should anything happen that theoretically you can report it, or that he has the sense of, I better behave because she knows who I am, she can find my work, she can whatever, and that he'll behave. And again, one, I am surprised that I hear way more about this from women in the US than in Germany, even though it's legal over here. And the second one is most women in prostitution I've met almost never did this. It was not practically possible, not if you're in a walk-in brothel. I don't hear it when I read the John forums, the men saying, and then I showed her my ID and then I gave her my info. That's not a routine thing. And it's my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, that that's mostly accessible to like very high-end escorting. I don't hear about that. The streets, forget about it, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, pretty common here in Canada, at least, is service provider forums, which that's what they're called. I don't like the term service providers, but it's a subset of the Escort Review Board. It's a private lounge area within those websites where only, in theory, women who are sex sellers can access those areas. What was alarming was that for many years, the main moderator of the Escort Review Board was also allowed to access what they call the SP lounge, service provider lounge. So I'm often like, okay, this guy's a sex buyer. He's running this mega forum, and now he's been generous enough to create this area for women only, but he's still in there. So how much is he relaying back to the men? Because the men also have what's called the members lounge, and that's where the men can talk about the women, and it can't be publicly seen. You have to be granted access to that by proving yourself on the main portion of the board. So a lot of women will do a single or double reference, and that's what I did mostly in the later years that I was in prostitution, was say, you have to give me a reference. And so they would give a reference of a woman, and then I would contact her and say, is this guy safe? Is he good? But the thing that's so faulty about that is when the man says, to the woman, can I use you as a reference? What woman is going to say, no, you were terrible and I'm not going to give a reference? She'll always say yes, usually no matter what, or maybe not reply or something and say I was busy, but more often than not, she'll say yes. Then when she speaks to the woman, sometimes she would say, yeah, he's okay, but he did these terrible things, so watch out for that. Or, no, he's not okay. But rarely would it be the latter, because if she said, no, he's not okay, then that original woman would go back to that requesting John and say, your reference didn't clear you. I can't stay with you. Apparently you stealth women, you remove condoms, or you don't pay your tally or whatever, don't pay your fee. And then he, of course, is now could possibly be a danger to that woman, right? Like, so women won't want to put themselves in those situations. So sometimes, women will just say like, yeah, he's okay, because it goes back to what I was told, right? Don't scare other women. Your experience with him might be different than that of another woman. So there are some so-called elite courtesans that will require ID. And those are usually women charging like about $500, $600 an hour. And some of them have been fortunate to get that. But typically what they will do instead of, if a guy says like, I don't want to give my ID, then they'll say, okay, well then you have to come as a walk-in to the brothel. And then they'll stay with him in that setting because in their mind, that's a safer setting than them going to his home or apartment or a hotel that he's rented or whatever, which of course, that's a whole nother myth is the,
escorting is the safest.
Yeah, or this is safer than that. Like it's at the end of the day, it goes right back to what you said early on in that you're alone with that man in the room in whatever setting you're in. So we do see some ID stuff, but then, on the review boards, and I just made a tweet about this not too long ago, I often grab little screenshots from there to show people like how these men are talking. And one guy was like, yeah, with how many of these women are on drugs and are desperate and have like boyfriends/pimps, why the hell would I ever give them my ID? So it even goes beyond this argument of them being criminalized as the reason why they don't want to give their ID into them being worried about, like you said, the pimps, right? Those are the ones that they fear, or the drug dealers of these women. And so we tried to get the city to take ID from the men. We said, if this is a business like any other, and if you've worded your bylaw so that you're not licensing prostitution, wink, wink, just an erotic massage or, an encounter between two people, then why can't you take ID? If the women have to give you all this information, their ID, an annual police record check, every bit of information, like everything, why aren't we doing that to those who are actually causing the harm and are doing the choking, are doing the stealthing, are doing the robbing, the stalking? And, then we had the pro-prostitution lobby fight us on that and say, it'll all go underground. If you do that, no John will come. And it's like, well, like we can't win. How can we keep women safe? No matter what we try to do, we are shut down. And so there's no way to make it safe because no one will give an inch and say, yeah, okay, I'll give my ID, or yeah, okay, we'll name that prostitution is happening, or any of these things to actually bring it up out of the underground that they are insisting that we keep it in right now.
I mean, that's really like a whole episode about that the industry needs to be in the twilight. That's what I say. Not totally underground because the Johns need to find it and they don't want to put in tons of effort. If it was all word of mouth, that'd be too big digitalized world where this is a mega industry that would really hamper the business model. So the industry requires that one big part of being like findable, but not have too many people look what's really going on behind the facade because they might be appalled at all the disrespect and violence. One part of it is that the Johns don't want their partners finding out because at least some like half of them are in a relationship. So Johns themselves hate transparency and they will never want it. And that's inherent to the industry. And a potent example from Germany is that during COVID, that was the one time the government said, hey, Johns, we're going to need you to put down your info for tracing potential COVID infections. And men were admitting on the forums they keep putting down fake info because they're not, the brothel isn't, calling your phone number every time, double checking if this whatever guy exists or if that's really him, or they were putting down fake info. There's such a big unwillingness. And again, it's exceptional that the government asked the Johns to do anything because we're so willing to put all these rules and regulations on the women, but everyone's like, all the nice Johns will leave and only the bad ones will be there if we put any kind of request on them, even something as mild as, I don't know, leaving a phone number. I mean, even if you do get the info from the guy, what are you going to do with that? The chance of a successful lawsuit after he has assaulted you is slim. It's slim for any woman, but especially for a woman in the sex trade. And people from the US might forget that many countries don't even have sex offender lists. We don't have them in Germany. We respect the privacy of perpetrators. I don't know enough about the effectiveness of sex offender lists to know if, they should be everywhere. Just to say, if one of the methods would be, she's got his name, she types him in and sees he's a local sex offender, that's not even possible in places like Germany, really.
Yeah, in America it is. They have a public sex offender registry, but here in Canada, it's private and it's for police only. So I think, in countries that do have it, there's different approaches to it, but that's exactly it. It's always the transparency. We need to know everything about the person being victimized and nothing about the victimizer. And how does that bode for harm reduction? It's all a reactive system. going back to the fact that you can only act on any of that ID info after the fact. So yeah, okay, it's great. You have his info. You could try to take him to court in this male-dominated society and hope that you win. But are you going to be able to reclaim any losses, either financially or what has been done to you spiritually and emotionally or physically? Like, the harm has already been done. So if we're talking about harm reduction and harm prevention, none of these things bode well with that at all.
And it's the same with these kind of ugly mugs projects. I do actually support them. I think, like you mentioned with the Forum for the Women, I think even a government with the equality model should have infrastructure for women to talk amongst each other, to share information, to warn of especially dangerous men. I totally support it, just not as the only measure. But even if there is that system, someone got raped for that guy to be on the list. Someone got battered. Someone got robbed. Something really horrible has to happen. And if you actually look up these projects that are often, called ugly mugs or bad date lists or whatever, and you are even in like a medium-sized city, you will be appalled how long the list is. You'll be like, wait, last month, this many women who managed to end up reporting it to the system got severely assaulted, attempted kidnapping, and it'd be like, wow, it's a pandemic of violence. Like, once you've read these, you're like, how's it conscionable to say to any woman that's a job like any other, go do it, it'll be fine? Like, I support the projects at the base, but it should be, of course, in women's hands and not some sex industry profiteer, semi-digital pimp guy, but they are totally insufficient. It's totally not enough.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, that's the problem too, is that those things are always an extension of the sex workers' work groups and lobbies and, profiteers and owners, operators, all that kind of stuff. Like, I also support those forums being for women, but I support them being ran by, women's organizations and things like that. But that's the problem, is that the prostitution lobby has turned the women in prostitution against anyone who is actually trying to help them, and saying, oh, they're just trying to encroach on your labor rights and all this kind of stuff, that they see us as the enemy. So they're like, well, I don't want to give any information about a bad guy to these people because they're going to use it as ammunition to use it against the industry, right? To argue against the industry, which, yeah, we probably would, because it's helping to show what's happening, but then the problem is whenever you keep these options for women under these contexts of this notion of sex work is work and through these like exploiters and pimps and buyers and everybody, then it's not authentic, because women, again, have to play that role. So they can't even be totally honest. Like, CEASE, the organization here that runs the John School that I mentioned earlier, it actually started when I first left prostitution. I started working with CEASE, helping women testify in court against men who had hurt them, either buyers, pimps, whoever. And so I always said, like, okay, when I was in the industry, there was a wall of shame where the police would bring us some pictures of these guys, but of course their images change over time and stuff like that. They weren't updated. So I said, I'm going to try to make CEASE a ground hub for women to submit information. And women were. So then I created what we called the bad date binder. And so we would take condoms, a health nurse, and the bad date binder, and that would welcome us, in most cases, into the brothels. And the women were like, okay, it's someone who's not going to stigmatize me because she used to be a sex seller. I can get free condoms. That's going to save me a lot of costs. I can get STI checks where I don't have to go disclose that I'm selling my body at a health clinic. This nurse knows because it's here. And I can get some information on these bad Johns. So then obviously we went digital in time with that, right? And stopped carrying around this binder and made it an app. But then the city of Edmonton said, we want to be a part of that app. And so then they started telling everyone in the industry, oh, if you don't want to submit information to CEASE because they're an abolitionist organization, submit it to us and we will post it on the app for you. So then all of a sudden it kind of looked like this initiative that the city had created, that the city was operating. And they really did that to a lot of harm reduction policies that we implemented. They piggybacked on it, and then they look like the savior, right? Because, oh, our licensors, our city folks, they're doing all this harm reduction work for us. These abolitionists are arguing against sex work. So the city really inevitably made us the enemy. And same thing, like with the IDing of men, like men are not going to stop buying sex. Many of them, they're entitled. They are unfortunately sometimes addicted, all these things that we could talk about. But people think that if they have to show ID or if that there's any transparency, they're going to run away and scatter. And yes, sometimes they'll change what they're doing. And if that meant that maybe we had less brothels, I didn't see that as a bad thing, right? We have right now about 31 licensed brothels, body rub centers in our city of a million people. And then we have many, like tons that are wrongfully licensed as what they call health enhancement centers. We've got many micros, which are unlicensed apartments, hotel rooms, whatever, that are operating as brothels. So like, yes, okay, when you squeeze and tighten up in one area, you will see overflow into another, but then you adapt what you're doing, right? But the overall goal is to, bring this transparency. And if that's what people want, well, let's do it. But they don't want to do it. They want to argue that they can do it, but when you actually offer them the opportunities to implement transparency, no, that doesn't bode well for the buyer anonymity, his discretion. It's always paramount over the safety of the woman.
We want to take a brief moment to thank you for your listenership. As an independent volunteer collective, our episodes are only made possible because of donations from people like you. Please visit our website, www.redlightexposé.com, and click the donate button. Your support is greatly appreciated. And now, back to the episode.
So moving on to the next point of how women supposedly can make themselves safer in Germany, and I think this is almost universal, though not entirely, or one of the few services you get your money first and then you do the so-called service. The reason for that, I've come to understand, is that the volume of men who will aggressively ask for their money back is really high, and it's good to there's various ways to do it. Like women get the money up front and they often they go to another room or they lock it. I've read a lot of time women lock it in like a post box so that he can't, grab it and run, which men like to do. Or with brothels, they have like some kind of in-house currency where you can run away with the currency, but it's worthless outside the brothel. So there is an expectation going into the prostitution interaction that you have to prepare for potential robbery. And that's my understanding, the main reason that women want to get their money first, so that they have a decreased chance of, like I said, grabbing the money and running out or pushing her away, because again, he's physically stronger. A decreased chance of that happening.
But even without robbery, it's just the fear that he's not going to pay, that he's going to refuse to pay, which a number of men absolutely do. And again, think of customer mentality. If I order someone, let's say, to renovate my roof and they do a shoddy job and the roof tiles are coming off, I might, refuse payment or reduce the payment. And in the same way, these guys, for example, there's a German man who took a woman to court for not giving him an orgasm. Theoretically, the German law says that incomplete service in the sex trade cannot get you your money back. But he managed to file that case under some kind of fraud. Like, she had advertised that there's orgasm guarantee and he didn't have one. And so he actually won that case and she had to pay for the court proceedings. The female judge ordered her to pay the court proceedings. So women want to avoid refusal of payment, but even if they can enforce that, he might still fight for getting his money back. And crazy men might take a woman to court over it. And if you're in Germany, you might have a case.
Mm-hmm. And going back to the episode that you and I recorded with Michelle Abel about language, I think we actually maybe touched on this. In Edmonton, what ended up happening is that women were severely pressured to not accept the money up front first. And buyers would use this terrible analogy of equating us to a meal, which is quite fitting when you think about it, something being consumed. But they said, look at a restaurant. If you go to a cheap, crappy restaurant like McDonald's, you pay first and then you get your food. But if you go to a very fancy fine dining establishment, you sit down, you enjoy the experience, it's all good, and then you pay for your meal after. So they started using the payment upfront approach by women as a way to almost say that they were of the lower quality women. And, obviously that's very dangerous. And so what I ended up doing was putting a little table in my brothel room and saying, okay, when you arrive, put the donation on the table and then we'll deal with it after. And so my hope was that they would put the money there on its own, but that doesn't give you a chance to count it because, you put the man in the room, you start a shower, you ask him what he wants to drink, you go back, you sign his fake name or whatever into a book, you mix him his drink and then you go back in. So in that moment, in theory, I thought, okay, he's put his money there. That way, both people know that it's there, that he did arrive with money, but you don't have to fight him for it after. But really, I look back at that now and I'm like, well, that's quite foolish, because really, if he wanted to at the end, he could just grab that money, push me aside and run out the door. So I think the better way to do it is what you said. Absolutely.
And it just, now that we're talking, came to me. The other reason is that it helps him maintain the illusion. Because if he, just had his orgasm and it's over, and men pay for a certain amount of time over here in Germany, something like, sometimes it's just 20, 30 minutes. They do really want to get the whole, so much fighting about, oh no, I still have 5 minutes. We got to keep this going for another 5 minutes. It ends when the time runs out. If then potentially post-orgasm, he has to then consider the money, it makes him feel icky. And if he can forget about the money, because that was half an hour ago or an hour ago or 2 hours, whatever, also helps maintain his delusion that maybe he gets a peck on the cheek and he feels like, oh, he just left his secret lover or something, that kind of fantasy that men want to have.
Yeah, it finishes on that note. Exactly, right? Like, it's not finishing on the money note.
Yes.
Yeah, it's weird, because I think some buyers prefer it a certain way and others prefer it the other way. Like, some are like, here, like, even whenever I'd say put the money on the table or on the little shelf thing, they'd say, here, just take it and go put it away, and then we're done with that, and then we can get comfortable and relax, or whatever silly line that they would say. I'm like, okay, buddy. But then other ones would go on the forums and say, I refuse to give her money up front, because then where is the incentive for her to do what I want? So, I think it came down to how trusting they were of us, whether they wanted to give that money or not, and how it played into their illusion, right? Did it feel better to give the money up front when it felt like you were paying to access the facility, and then you didn't have to pay anything to the woman directly? Or did it feel better to wrap up the session, so-called session, and then, finish with, okay, oh, and here's your money, PS bye. Like, yeah, it was so different for each of them that you never kind of really knew what approach to go with. But it was always this awkward moment every time, whether it was beforehand or after, when they would actually take the money out of their wallet and hand it to you and you took it in your hand. It was the most freaky, weird, inauthentic feeling ever, because then it's like, okay, I'll go get my lingerie and I'll come back and give you oral sex in 5 minutes. See you soon. Like, very, very awkward, all of it.
And that ties into the next point of what women are supposed to do to prevent violence, which is never, ever shatter his ego. Never. Ever do anything. And for real, I will post all the links about sex worker safety advice. And a part of it is always managing his mood. Never put him in a bad... Can you imagine if we did that to women in relationships with boyfriends, with abusive boyfriends? It's like, this is like what the anti-abuse community, they call the fawn response. When you are in a dangerous situation with an aggressive man, you placate him. You're like, oh no, I'll make you comfortable, baby, blah, blah, blah. Like, whatever you need. I'm sorry, that was totally my fault. You were so wonderful. It's understandable that you got angry. Like, this happens in domestic violence, but women in prostitution are encouraged to do this. You feel unsafe, soothe him, make a joke.
Mm-hmm.
Joking is a coping mechanism I've heard over and over from women. Never show fear, never show disgust, because then he starts feeling like an abuser or a predator, or he starts feeling insulted, and that's when he gets dangerous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Never say no outright. Find tricks to, like, I remember this example of a woman from Australia saying that the men, she said, never put your finger in my anus. And the men would do it anyway. And instead of saying, what the fuck are you doing? Get your hand off of me. You cannot say that. You have to, like, playfully push the hand away, like playfully pull the hand off when you've just been assaulted. Mm-hmm. And this is advice given to women.
Yeah. Ignore the assault that just happened and redirect. And that was what I did as well. I never in 7 years of prostitution ever recall saying no to a John. And so when they would start doing something, I'd be like, whoa, like what you said, like trying to put a finger in your bum or whatever. I'd be like, whoa, wrong area here, right here, and then they try to do it again or whatever. And I'd say, oh, you know what I'd really like you to do right now? I'd like you to do this instead. So like, it was a way of stopping what they were doing and making them do something else. And really it was, I don't know why I even did that, because I hated everything that they did. It was all terrible, but some just felt worse in the moment, right? Because it was such an utter violation. But yeah, like we always talk about like fight, flight, or freeze, but we never talk about the fawn response. And that is so common. Like fighting response, we can't fight those men. We've already gone over why that is. They're bigger than us, stronger. Flight, where are you going to go? You're going to run out of the room? Well, sorry, tomorrow you're going back because you got another shift. Freeze, well, then you're a starfish or a dead lay or whatever they want to call you, or you were complicit because you didn't stop them. So then the only option that these women do have is to fawn and to try to stroke his ego and verbal judo, talk him down, redirect, all that kind of stuff. And I gave all that advice to women too in the licensing course. And I look back and I'm like, wow, that was really damaging that I said those things. But in the moment, that's really the only option that she has when she's in that private space. So it's like these things that you tell women to do, they're harmful, they're damaging because the whole system is, but it's all that they can do in that moment. It's just tragic. Like you go home and you're just like, fuck, it's grim.
These are totally understandable survival techniques that I think even if no one teaches them, women will develop them. You don't even need a course. Sometimes like these courses are like mildly insulting because one, you learn this pretty quickly, otherwise you will literally not survive. And second, I'm not even saying this is necessarily the intention, but it ends up being victim blaming because when she does get assaulted, she's like, should I have smiled more? Should I have said no more gently? Should I have done this? It's really hard to tell someone these are things you can do to make yourself safer, but if you don't do it or it doesn't work, it's still not your fault if you get assaulted, which I firmly believe it's always on the man. He should have read, when you pulled a face, he should have paid attention to your body language. He should never go into a situation where a woman is afraid to say no, which is the standard situation of prostitution. The reality, the way that this advice is given, and I have to say, this, survivors of the sex industry are told all the time, you weren't professional enough. You weren't charismatic enough, intelligent enough, good enough at screening people. Like pretending that women in prostitution have some kind of superpower to identify and or pacify an attacker.
It's horrific. It's horrific what we do in regards to that victim blaming. And I remember, there was a woman that I was so close with in prostitution, like probably about 5 years that I sold. We were duo partners. Like I literally considered her my sister. Like she was the closest person in my life. And whenever I left prostitution, I felt like I could confide in her, even though she was still in there and is very much I am a sex worker, like total liberal feminist, like neoliberal feminist. But I remember her saying that to me. She goes, whenever I would tell her all these terrible things that happened to me and why I was leaving. And, it was only little snippets because I was still in that place of unpacking everything and deprogramming, which takes many years. But when I felt like I could confide in her, that was exactly her response. Well, that was your fault. You didn't screen guys good enough. You stayed with anyone. You didn't do this. You didn't do that. And I said to her, like, I was needing to pay bills. I had a man living off me. I was trying to go to school. I was $60,000 in debt whenever I got in the industry because of 7 years of toxic relationships with men who used me financially and all these things. And like, I couldn't say no to a lot of these men, because I didn't have the confidence or self-worth in myself from those abusive relationships, plus all the compounding effects of years of prostitution. But then at the same time, like when every man discusses you, you really stop being choosy because you're like, I don't care who he is. I hate all of them. I don't hate them, but you know what I mean? Like I hate them for what they're doing to me. I don't want to be with any of them. So at that point, you almost kind of get lax where you're sort of like, it's all terrible. Just give me the money, do your thing, get the fuck out. So I really felt victim blamed by her. And, our relationship like now is completely destroyed, absolutely destroyed because of that. And many other things where I challenge her in what she believes and feels. And she feels offended by that because she is a quote unquote sex worker and I should respect her labor rights and her autonomy and all these things. But yeah, the whole thing is just, I don't know. I get so mad. I get so mad whenever I think about people telling women like, you weren't good enough to not be victimized. Like it's your fault. It just goes right back to that victim blaming.
It's awful, especially since you were friends. I'm sorry that you hear it. It hurts the most when it comes from someone close to you, someone who should be on your side. On some level, it's an understandable self-preservation because when you don't feel like you have a way out, you have to tell yourself, I do have that superpower.
Yes.
I hear that a lot from when I have these people skills. I can tell you this fast if someone's a predator. I'm the best at this. And I'm sure women in prostitution are probably better than the average woman because they have to be. But no one has that superpower, and it's so dangerous to suggest that women do.
Exactly. And I still, to this day, feel I do have a heightened degree of reading people's energy because of the prostitution experience. But then I also remind myself that my absolute best buyer of 4 years, the nicest man, polite, respected boundaries, like easy to orgasm, like he was so quote unquote ideal John, right? Like the best that you could get of any of them. He recorded me off of a watch for many years, off of his phone, a spy watch. And I didn't find out till his daughter emailed me saying that she had found the videos and deleted them, thankfully. But she said, it looks like in the videos, you don't know that you're being filmed. And I was like, that guy? Like, really, that guy? Like, he was the one every time would bring me some fresh strawberries, roses, so polite, so kind. And for 4 years filmed me. So, then whenever I left prostitution, I was so terrified before outing myself publicly that I would be on a porn website, that, that would be sent to my family or friends or an employer once I left. And so a lot of these things too, the fear that gets installed in women almost sort of forces us to have to come out and disclose that we were in prostitution to kind of take that power away from people, right? Because that was always the threat too, is I'll out you if you don't do this, or I have some information on you. And unfortunately, a lot of women would do that too, right? To try to drive out the competition. Did I ever want to go totally public talking about these things? Not really. Obviously, there's no glory in it, especially when you've been where I've been, where you've been an owner, unfortunately. But at the same time, like, it did feel empowering. That was the first time I actually felt empowered in the 18 years now that I've been involved in this arena, was when I could publicly say my truth and not worry about someone else saying it on my behalf or putting out a distorted version of it.
There's really no adequate words when, if you'd catalog all the crimes that a woman experiences in half a decade plus of prostitution, you'd be in court forever.
Mm-hmm.
If these actually all went to court, you'd be in court forever.
Yeah, and I have, like, honestly, a wealth of info that I could destroy the lives of many men, many prominent men. Like, I turn on my news and I hear a news anchor locally here, and he was a sex buyer of mine. I see people out in the community that I know have exploited me, other women in prostitution. And there was a guy who posed as a fake photographer and did some POV shots of me, which are called point of view shots. And they were just supposed to be photos of me with his penis in my vagina, like from my navel down. And they were supposed to go on, like, I don't know, sex toy ads or something over in an Asian country. I can't remember exactly what it was, but this guy set up like a complete fake business all about like fake videographing, fake photography. It was so authentic. And he got another girl and myself, and, obviously took full videos, full photos of us. He's what we call a pic collector. So none of it was authentic. He had documentation. He took our IDs. Like, it was so legit, because I, at that point, was already in the industry a long time and I had my spidey senses up, and he duped me and her, obviously this other woman. And I eventually went to the police with it, and I said, I have his address in Calgary. I verified it. This is his address for his actual business. I have his legal name. There's cameras at the Westin Hotel in downtown Calgary showing him pulling into the parking lot with his truck, his license plate, everything. They can give you all that info. And police said, well, no, it looks like he found a loophole because he filmed what happened. So essentially it was pornography, and now it's a civil rights or a civil issue, where you have to take him to court for not paying you for the content that you helped him produce. So I said, okay, but if I work for like the phone company, or if I pose as though I work for the phone company and I don't, and I go around lying to people saying, hey, knocking door to door, sign up for my phone company plan, and people do, is that a civil issue? Like, no, it only becomes that way because we've made these laws that, again, looking at pornography, totally okay, prostitution illegal, but film it, now it's pornography. It doesn't qualify. So the law is not in favor of actually protecting women. And so when people talk about, again, all these safety measures and this and that, even if they don't work in the moment, which they often don't, they also don't translate into you getting any type of retribution in the justice system later. So, I know where this guy lives. I know all of his info, and nothing can be done. And he still probably has my videos. I said, can you at least go there and get my videos back? No, he has the property rights of them, and he just didn't pay you for it. But you signed a consent saying that he had copyright. Then again, once I left prostitution, every day I spent hours a day combing internet websites, trying to find these videos of me that I know he has shared on some kind of forum with other men that, do this. And, I know that you are very familiar with like Korea and a lot of Japan, all that upskirting and the bathroom stuff. And oh my God, like we're just going off sideways. So this is just another thing where we could make another episode, and we probably will. But all of this, it's set up to harm women. The whole system is set up to harm women, and there's no way to make it safe, in a nutshell.
I want to do a quick side note on dress codes, because there are recommended clothes. This is mostly the street situation. I'd be interested to hear from you if you've heard about this in other settings, but where, again, these organizations talking about sex work and harm reduction go out and tell women, for example, don't wear jewelry that someone might pull and strangle you with. Don't have hair that's easy to grab and pull. Don't have shoes that you cannot run away in. Which, again, if we see outrage when this is like, people tell schoolgirls, if your skirt's too short, you'll get assaulted. If you have a ponytail, someone grabs it. That is anti-rape advice, quite offensive anti-rape advice given to women in general, but package it as sex worker safety. And this is job advice. And the outrage is minimal.
Yeah, totally. And we haven't seen that here because, again, any kind of information that comes out, they will never say prostitution is occurring, right? So like the city, they don't give that kind of information, just because if they did, they would have to inevitably say, don't wear a ponytail, because when the man is behind you having sex with you and pulls your hair, it could strangle you essentially, ultimately, by bending your neck so far back. So they will never say these types of things, because in order for them to say those types of things, they have to mention the sex and the intimacy and the connection between the bodies of the people in the exchange. So yeah, I've seen those publications though. Like I think New Zealand has that horrific one showing the woman being like strangled by the man in a vehicle. And then it's like, you would know more about it.
That's from Italy. That one's from Italy.
I'll put that in the description. I thought it was the New Zealand like sex work collective, whatever they call themselves.
They probably have something adjacent, because whether it's a country with prohibition, semi-prohibition, legalization, deregulated, the safety advice remains the same.
Yeah. And it's so weird because like, okay, don't wear heels, but the men want heels. Don't have your hair long where it can be grabbed, but the men want long hair. Make sure you have something on you where you can hide a weapon or something like that. Well, no, sorry, you're naked. You can't do that. Like, I think, in street exploitation, a lot of the women, a lot of the women don't get fully naked. They're in a car. So it's typically just a skirt, and then underwear is moved to the side, or pants are pulled down to the knees, stuff like that. So then they'll tell those women like, well, they won't tell them again. No one will actually say it outright, but it's implied, like hide a knife in your socks or something like that. But then what women fail to realize is that, first of all, you could be arrested and charged with carrying a concealed weapon in Canada for doing that.
Just quickly want to note, in Germany, pepper spray, you're actually not allowed to carry around pepper spray. You could get in trouble, legally in trouble.
Same here. But if you buy bear mace and then say that you're like a hiker, sometimes you'll get, some leeway on it, but then they'll say, well, you're not hiking right now. So that always comes back down to that police discretion. And we know that, unfortunately, a lot of people, even police, see the women on the streets as the nuisance, as the problem, right? So people fail to understand that like any weapon that a woman has typically will be used against her. And that's what's been found in a lot of situations, reports, studies.
We know this about gun violence, right?
Because again, we don't have that biological strength to overpower a man. And whenever a man is angry, sexually entitled, looks at you as nothing, subhuman, what's to stop them from taking that knife and stabbing you because you're just a dead hooker? No one cares about dead hookers. Like, it's such total disregard. And so it gives, again, going back to what Kathy King, my co-author of the book, said, the false sense of security to women, right? Like, oh, I've got a weapon, I'll do this, I'll do that. No, you won't. You won't. That's the sad reality.
And if you actually end up shooting the guy or really injuring him, you'll go to jail.
Yeah.
They will not accept, even if you are a minor. We've mentioned elsewhere, and we'll talk more about the trafficking of minors. We'll go more into these cases where the victim, girls like Santoya Brown, we'll put some information about this in the show notes for those who want to look it up right now. If you successfully defend yourself, this is true in domestic violence as well. Mm-hmm. There's a good chance that he's going to take you to court. And if he's dead, obviously, you're likely going to go to prison. And Actually, when women injure or kill men in self-defense, they will often get higher sentences than men who did so for pleasure or because they wanted to take out their anger. And feminists have said this, and I think it's totally true. People are appalled when women get violent. They're like, you're really breaking the myth of the eternally submissive, friendly, feminine woman when you get violent. So even though, that's a woman who, in many of these situations, just a total victim of a serious male violence. So often she's a girl, but because our society is actually more offended that a woman would act like this, the context, it takes total backstage.
Absolutely. Yeah, we saw that here with the case of a woman named Helen Nasland. Her husband had abused her for 30 years, more than 30 years, I think, and like atrocious recounting of abuse. So she did coordinate, as far as I know, like it was a premeditated murder, but she, after 30 years of abuse and really no option to leave, which many women, when they're in their whatever 50s, that age, like what real options do they have to leave? They're so just emotionally, spiritually, mentally, physically battered that the only thing that they can see as their way of freedom is the death of that man, because it is so intrinsically tied to their identity. So she killed her husband and got, I think it was something like 3 times the sentence length that the average man gets for murdering his wife because, rough sex defense, choked her during sex, and she asked for it, but then, oops, she died. Like, it's so wrong what we're doing in so many areas of this. But yeah, that's a big issue with that self-defense.
My friend who studies law explained it to me like this. Premeditated murder will get you a longer sentence than if you are overcome with passion, a crime of passion. I mean, we see that all the time in the domestic violence reporting, right? There is understanding for a man who loses his shit because nagging, because infidelity, real or imagined. The point is, a crime of passion, and so-called, and sudden physical violence that mostly women are not capable of will get you a lower sentence. So men committing these kinds of crimes, right, abusing a woman for 30 years, then killing her suddenly will get you a lower sentence than if you're the woman abused for 30 years who poisons him or gets someone else to do it, and any of those kinds of things, because then there's this whole legal category in Germany of like malicious intent or something. But the domestic abuser who loses it, so-called, he doesn't qualify. Then it's just manslaughter. Isn't that great?
There's just really no way to make it safe other than relying on another man to keep you safe. And what man is going to keep you safe when he's there watching and allowing you to be, commercially abused sexually? Like, is he even going to be the type to stick up for you? And, so then that's going into the debate around bouncers and security and all this kind of stuff.
His financial interest is to not have an upset customer, and be that you've hired this individual man, which again, most women can't even afford. I very, very rarely even hear of anything like this. Maybe the escort agency gives you a driver. Maybe the brothel has bouncers. It is simply a statistical truth that a lot of people in the security industry have criminal backgrounds. It is in Germany. I'm sorry. It's just a fact. A lot of these are very shady people who, again, their interest is profit motive. Their background is not heroism, defending women. It's not rare for that to be the legal job of someone who otherwise is, engaged in criminal activities with organizations like the Hells Angels. These are not women's friends. People love to say this. If there's a bodyguard, what guy is going to dare do something? I mean, there are examples of these guys, beating up the John or whatever if he's bothering the other customers at the brothel. But so many times it's in the interest of that guy to, be gentle, be like, oh, it's a misunderstanding. Can we come to some kind of agreement? I'll give him back half the money. You're just as likely to have that experience.
Mm-hmm. Really, those men are the bouncers, so-called, are there essentially to protect the product and the marketability and the sale of that product. And when the woman is a product, she can't be marketed if she's bruised up or injured, and she can't be sold as easily because some sex buyers, a very small portion, will not want to believe that they're buying a woman who has experienced any kind of abuse And so they'll be like, oh no. So really it's product protection is what those men are doing. And it goes back again to being a quiet accusation, right? Of saying you cannot be trusted. And that threatens the sex buyer's ego, right? So they don't want to see these bouncers too. And so a lot of times these brothels won't have bouncers. There's none in Edmonton that I know that have security whatsoever. It's always just women on site. Only the women who sell sex. That's the only people. And a receptionist who is usually female as well, because then it's more comfortable for the women to get changed in the change room with a female receptionist and everything. We do have a couple brothels that are owned by men. Actually, many are owned by men, but figureheaded by women. But the ones that are owned by men, those ones actually, the men that go there, I think, do treat the women a little bit better because these male owners are so big and intimidating. But it's really going back down to, again, okay, this is your product and I don't want to offend you by offending against your product. It's never, respect for the woman and then the bouncer enforces that. It's respect for that brothel and for the products being sold out of there and protecting that profiting that can occur. A lot of times these men are Johns themselves, right? So many sex buyers end up becoming drivers, end up becoming security guards, all those things because they just want to be around the women and hope to see them scantily clad, or hope that, these women will give them a discount later because they're also their so-called security guard. And so there's so many crossovers where, again, I've never seen a good man want to defend women in prostitution. And if he did, he would probably recognize that abolition and getting them away from those that are abusing them is the actual only method of safety.
Right. So you were talking about being filmed against your will. But, when people hear cameras in the context of prostitution, they often think of it as a safety measure. And cameras certainly do proliferate in the larger brothels, less so in the apartment brothels, which in Germany are a sizable chunks of like 30-40% is in pretty anonymous private apartments that could very well be like in your building. They're like very ordinary because, again, for the Johns, so really like their anonymity, if it seems like they're just visiting a random acquaintance or friend to anyone crossing them in the hallway, that's very comfortable. So if the place can afford the infrastructure, is willing to do it, then yeah, there's cameras outside and in the hallways. But you were saying how the women, at work, so to say, are in lingerie. In Germany, we even take it a step further. We have brothels that we euphemistically call sauna clubs, where the women are fully nude. Maybe they're wearing a tanga and high heels, because, of course, like even when you're totally naked, you should still be struggling in the worst possible, feet deforming, painful high heels. Yeah, fully nude, while most of the men tend to be in bathrobes. That's how those sauna clubs work. So that means that there is footage of you fully nude that, again, the brothel owner, who's not your friend, who at best is just a capitalist and at worst is a best buddy with the Hells Angels, he has that kind of footage of you. And people who don't believe me, I have a series of reaction videos to one of Germany's most notorious sauna club brothels. And I've pixelated all of it, which, by the way, it wasn't when it went on TV. I've pixelated the women's naked bodies. And so my first point being, cameras, again, pose actually a risk of revenge porn. They're actually also a tool for, again, if there's the Hells Angels or whoever, when he comes to the brothel, go to the camera security guy and be like, yeah, well, what was she doing? Show me. Like, what was she doing during the lunch break? Where's she right now? Show me. And the place where there won't be a camera, because that much of an overt risk of revenge porn, would be a problem, is in the rooms, which is where most of the violence happens. Inherently, cameras not only have ill protection, but they can actually be a threat.
Well said. So true. And I think back to like the cameras, and the only thing that I feel the camera did provide us was a heads up as to who was at the door, because there would be a live feed, right? So we'd be back in the staff room, as we called it, and we would see the cameras, and usually there was 4 to 6 different angles on hallways, entries to the actual building outside, and then one that was always pointed directly at the entryway of the brothel. So when men would come in and the door would chime, you'd see them on the camera, and that camera would be probably the best capture that you could get of that guy versus anything else, because it wouldn't be like an overhead shot. It would be trying to get more so right at his face. But you couldn't put those too close because then again, the men are like, oh my God, I'm on camera. And a lot of men for many years didn't know that they were on camera because, you could get some pretty low profile ones and stuff like that. But then eventually men did realize that they were on camera. And so that kind of got back into the whole like, oh, my privacy, my discretion. And so then we had to get a little bit more creative with cameras, or the men started getting more creative and they would come wearing hats and sunglasses. It was very, very common that they would have a hat and sunglass on. And if it was a baseball cap, that visor that sits on the front would really conceal their eyes quite well. And, after they learned where the camera was, they would never look in the direction of the camera. So they would walk in and they'd put their head down. So all that you would really kind of see is sort of the shape of a guy's body and like his face. And, who knows, like, with things like that, like with men especially, they have beards or they don't. So a beard, like I've seen some pretty ugly men get a beard and all of a sudden they're like, they've gone from a 2 to a 10, and I'm like, holy crap, it's a totally different person. So when people try to say, well, you have an image of this guy on the camera, that really didn't do anything for us at the end of the day, because it was so easy for them to change their appearance based on just facial hair issues and stuff like that, or however they wanted to style it. And then when COVID hit, luckily I was out of prostitution at that point, but women said it was the worst because then men are coming in with a mask. And the city was mandating that people wear masks in all city licensed businesses and stuff like that, which was kind of funny because they said once you're in the treatment room, as they would call it, then you're allowed to take out the mask or take off the mask. And that falls into all the lies basically around the occupational health and safety, right? Everything that we talk about, we're like, this is a whole nother episode, but that's getting into like the body suits and stuff to stop like, bodily fluid transfers, the gloves, the face shields, like none of that was mandated on anybody, but you had to wear a mask in the common areas where you could be passing by other people. But then as soon as you got in the treatment room, it's no holds barred. You can do whatever you want. So then the mask could come off. But I would always say to women at that course that I was speaking at, okay, so you get an image of this guy. What does that do for you? Does he live in Edmonton? So if the police put this image up, even on the 6 o'clock news, which they wouldn't ever typically, because then they're talking about how the city is licensing prostitution, which is illegal. And so nobody really talks about these things. So they will share it amongst themselves, the police departments and the city, and they would bring it to the brothels and show it to the women. But again, it's a lot of these cameras are really grainy and old school and not high definition. So you couldn't even really make out truly who this guy is. Then you got the mask and beard issues, which I mentioned. And I would say to these women, okay, so we see this all the time. Like if a guy goes and robs a liquor store, there's always cameras. They always have a picture of him. Those ones get on the news, right? Find this guy who helped rob this liquor store. But how often do we actually hear that those images lead to an arrest? It is so rare because of those issues of that graininess and people being like, well, maybe it's that person, but I don't think so. I know them. They would never do that. So people don't report all that. So you have these assist to identify, and you could go on like Edmonton Police Service website, and there's a whole section on their website, assist to identify. And it's cameras that have caught criminals doing crimes, and they're pleading for people to help identify them. Once again, this is a reactive response. The assault has already happened and we don't know this guy's legal name. We don't know anything. The camera systems might be in the parking lot. Sometimes brothels had that or still do. But did this guy drive a car there, or did he park a block away and walk? Did he take a taxi? It's really not giving you anything other than just what you saw with your own eyes when you were in that brothel right before you so-called accepted this man as your so-called client and took him in the room. Like it doesn't give you anything extra. So yes, it worked in the moment to stop you from going and greeting your uncle who was coming in to pay for sex, or a guy that you went to high school with, but it didn't do anything in regards to any kind of justice after the fact of an assault.
And the next thing that's often brought up as this great safety measure, like people, when they hear about the German brothels, they're like, oh my God, that changes everything, is the panic buttons.
The panic buttons. That's a hot topic.
There's so much to say, but actually the first thing I want to say before we get into what about this is not working is just for everyone listening to ask themselves, if I'm going into a sexual encounter and I need a panic button, I need a rape alarm, I just have this really considerable My fear of being assaulted is so high that I definitely need this around. Would you want to go into that encounter?
Mm-hmm.
I think vast majority of people say absolutely not. And that goes for all these safety measures. We could say that about any of these, but I don't know. The panic buttons, I feel like, are a really distilled version of this, like, because it's the call, the distress call, right? And we do know that women go on dates and take rape alarms, and that is, a sign of a society that has so much work to do. That is not a sign of a society that's looking out for women. It's the exact opposite. And so, what the panic button really symbolizes is proof that women are on constant alert, like we keep saying, constant vigilance. And that the whole rhetoric of this is two adults having, commercialized but still, fun, it calls it out for the farce that it is.
Yeah, exactly. Who in their home, as a casual dater, as a single woman, has a panic button in her bedroom? I don't know a single woman. I've never met a single woman that ever said that she had one. So why does that need to be implemented in a job like any other? It's just like all these other safety measures, in that it is that quiet accusation again. You will hurt me, or there's a big chance that you will. This is a dangerous encounter. There's this button that if you cross the line, I'm going to push it. A lot of times, even if women are at a position where they probably should push it and need to, they won't, because there's a lot of danger just in doing that, because you're in this enclosed space with this man. And so you can hide these panic buttons, but a lot of times, can you reach them is the same question. Like, there's so many considerations to the panic buttons. Like, will it be bumped accidentally? Will the police charge you if you do bump it accidentally? Because the ones here in Edmonton, most of them will go directly to the police emergency line, like 911 type thing.
Or the brothels will charge you. I heard this from a woman in Frankfurt. I'll link where she said it down below. In the Frankfurt brothels, quite infamous, where the brothel will fine you for the bouncers to come up. Nobody wants you to push that button.
Nobody. Yeah. The woman doesn't want to push it. The buyer doesn't want her to push it. And the brothel definitely doesn't want to have police there. Or even if it isn't a direct police line and it goes to like the owner or to like the office, the booking office or whatever might be on site, those people don't want it pushed, because then that means that they have to respond and go in there and put themselves in danger with a man who is assaulting a woman. Whenever I had my brothel, I put it in the staff room, but even that was dangerous, because like I thought of these things whenever I put it there. I realized, okay, there should be a panic button, just, in the event that you're robbed even, right? Because this is a cash-based business. And we'd be leaving there at 11 p.m. when the bylaw would stipulate closing hours. Now I think it's midnight. And you'd be leaving there 3 to 5 women, each with hundreds of dollars of cash and no men on site.
Sorry, can you explain very quickly why it's cash? It'll always be cash. Can we make a quick point as to why that also won't change?
Yeah, that's typically for buyer anonymity. And people will say, well, it's because, when buying sex is criminalized, men don't want to pay with their debit. But there are some brothels here in the city that protect their business and aren't charged with the offense of material benefit, as we call it, or living off the avails, because when the men arrive, they say, okay, you have to pay the house, the room fee, and then you can go into the room with the woman. And that's what I did as well, because I did that as a means of trying to ensure that the man actually did have money, but it also did have that effect for all of us, that it separated the business of the brothel from the so-called business of the woman. So then we weren't actually, nobody as an owner then was taking prostitution earnings. We were taking a rental fee from a so-called customer. And then whatever they do in the room, if they just sit and talk, or if they have intercourse, whatever they do, we don't know, right? And then we're not taking that money. Yeah, it was kind of just a messy thing. We're always looking for these loopholes, but men will sometimes, if they're single, be willing to, pay that by debit or credit. There are like the odd brothels that do offer that room rental to be paid, but never the money to the woman. That always has to stay in cash.
In Germany, there's an ATM outside every big brothel or in a red light district area. And the other reason is organized crime loves brothels for money laundering.
Yes. Yeah. There's an article, I should send it to you so that we can put it in the show notes, that found that there's like, I think the article said something like 700 shell companies approximately that are operating in Canada. Most of them are brothels, licensed, a lot of them, that are laundering money for organized crime. And that's exactly it, right? And a lot of those ATMs are actually owned by the brothel owners. So they're actually making a profit off of the men using the machine to get the money. So, $5 every time that machine is used or whatever goes back into the pocket of the owner. But it affords that man that protection and privacy where his wife or whoever, his bank, won't see that transaction happening at a brothel. But the brothels would be numbered companies. So even still, on a statement, it would just show up as a numbered company and then say Alberta Limited. So it's messy. The payment thing and all that has always been messy.
But it's just for people who assume that the robbery risk will just fix that by making all the transactions digital. It's not going to happen. Nobody in the system wants that to happen. But sorry, you were in the middle of saying something about panic buttons when I interrupted.
Oh, yeah. No, you didn't interrupt. I think we just always end up on these rabbit trails because like every point that we make has like 6 considerations around it. And it's so hard to stay on our focus of what we're trying to talk about because it's like, well, you can't understand this unless we talk about this. Like it's all part of this big thing. But yeah, it just, like I said, I put it back in the staff room, but then I thought to myself, okay, that's going to stop it from being accidentally bumped. So then police won't be called here for a false alarm. Can the woman push it in front of the man? No, obviously in reality. So I would always tell women if something goes really bad or if you're being robbed or anything like that, run to the staff room. I had a deadbolt, I had a solid door there, and then push the button, right? Because then at least you're in this secured area where this man doesn't see you push a button. He doesn't even know the button exists because it was under the shelf that we would sit and do our makeup and our hair at. So, very unlikely to be accidentally bumped and stuff. But then I thought to myself, well, if he's on top of me or her, whoever's in the room with him, and he's choking us or doing anything, it should be within reach where she can just reach over and slam that button. Can she even leave that situation to run to the staff room and push the button? So whether it's in the room or it's in a common area, it still has its negatives where it's just not really truly feasible that she can push it when it's needed.
And so now we've talked about all these different safety measures, and the point that I want to make tying it all together, I spent some time studying 4 decades of homicide in the German sex trade, which was insightful, but obviously not great for my mental health. I mean, there were crimes in there that my mind couldn't even conceive of, that you would come up with doing this to another human being, just methods of torture that the most sadistic killers used. But, don't need to be sensationalist about it. I'm not going to name those things here now. We might do episodes focused on homicide at some point, but homicide is just the tip of the iceberg. Like we've mentioned throughout, violence is a spectrum, and homicide is obviously the most overt one. But we're also talking about rape. We're also talking about the dissociation of unwanted sex, which veers into rape, and all of this stuff. But including the things that the law recognizes, be it Germany or Canada, as violence, they happen in every sector of the sex trade and under every law. It is true that the street sector is statistically more dangerous, but indoor prostitution is still highly, highly dangerous. And when I was looking at these homicides, which, many of the articles also mention other crimes that happen at the brothel that are non-lethal but still serious, none of these measures stop them. The biggest brothel with the most expensive so-called safety infrastructure still has homicides in it, still has women lying in their own blood. I'm not trying to be sensationalist. I'm just trying to burst this fantasy bubble that is still so popular that legal makes it safe. There are still many ways that men can get away with it. That is the next depressing part when they commit these crimes, be it rape, assault, homicide, robbery, because it's such an anonymized trade and there's so many suspects. And homicide detectives straight up tell us when we find a woman murdered or a victim of attempted murder, we look for the last John. That's just a fact. But it's hard to find him because he was, one of half a dozen guys that day and usually don't have his name or any information. It is, unfortunately, even under legalization, still true that from a practical point of view alone, an opportunistic attacker of, whatever type of crime still has statistically good chances of getting away with it. I wish it wasn't so, and I don't want to suggest the police doesn't care at all, and that's, I'll put a link down below on a research study into German sex trade homicide. German police takes these cases very seriously, and they do investigate, but they still often end up cold. None of us want these things that we're saying to be true, right? I mean, I'm so often reading things I was like, I wish I could block out in my mind this information and go back to ignorance or deny it or disprove it, but the reality is the system is set up, it's focused on men's pleasure, men's convenience, and the immense cost to women is just totally disregarded. And if you changed that system to be, about women's safety, about women's pleasure, whatever, the whole industry would just fall apart. It cannot function in a way that is pro-woman. It's not possible.
So true. And a paper that I want to just make mention of for the listener that I think really is quite powerful, and it was one of the first papers I read whenever I was coming out of my conditioning and starting to be deprogrammed, is a paper that Melissa Farley wrote in 2004 called Bad for the Body, Bad for the Heart. Prostitution harms women even if legalized or decriminalized. And in that paper, she says, in prostitution, there is no avoiding sexual harassment, sexual exploitation, rape, and acts that are equivalent of torture. And then, later she cites the Special Committee on Pornography and Prostitution, which was a Canadian commission that happened in 1985, so quite some time ago. And they found that the death rate of women in prostitution was 40 times higher than that of the general population. And I've seen other reports that say even higher. Like I think I've seen some that were saying, 200 times the rates and stuff like that. Like just statistically alarming stuff. And that really loops back into what we were saying about harm being inherent to this activity, and that everything that we try to do is a Band-Aid solution. It's putting lipstick on a pig, and we're not actually going to the root of the issue, which is misogyny and objectification and differences between the economics of being male versus female in a society, and how that plays out socially in different contexts and stuff. So it always just kind of comes back to saying, okay, harm reduction, but are we working towards harm elimination? Because really the only harm elimination that we can do in this commercialized sex context is no more of it. And I think people just can't fathom a world where it doesn't exist. They all hold a very defeatist mentality and this belief of inevitability. And I think that's really where we have to start with people, is to challenge that. Because until you can get people to envision or feel inspired and motivated to act in pursuit of harm elimination, then all these things that are harm reduction, okay, maybe it's going to reduce a little bit of harm, but the harm is still happening. There's harm reduction, but there's still harm. So, we need to get to this point of no harm. And that's a big hill that a lot of people can't see the top of, but we have to start with baby steps somewhere. And to that end, really quickly, because we mentioned torture, I also want to direct people to the work of Linda McDonald and Jean Sarson. They've, for 30 years, been doing incredible work tying in what they call non-state torture to prostitution. So in Canadian law, torture is only recognized when it's done by a state actor, so the government. But then these similar acts that the government would do, I don't know if Canadian government does torture people, I'm not saying that, but any acts that are described by basically the UN as torture are only when a government actor inflicts it. But those same acts, so like abusing people, waterboarding, whatever, flogging their feet, hanging them by their arms for long durations,
cutting, burning, needling.
Yeah, exactly. All this kind of stuff, choking, whatever. It all can be done by who they call non-state actors. So just the general public, right? So really, they've been working tirelessly for 30 years now to try to have non-state torture recognized by Canadian law and implemented into our criminal code. And until we do that, we really don't have a way to address the harms that are happening. Like what we have right now is like aggravated sexual assault, or just sexual assault, or just assault. But like those things don't even encapsulate the degree of it, which actually takes it to the level of torture. And so it's very dismissive of honoring what women are being subjected to. So a lot of these things are language-based and policy-based, but we have to start with this understanding that harm is inherent to prostitution. That's step one to it all.
We need those women to come on the podcast and really do
the
whole episode. Would be great. And we try on this podcast, and on, a slightly optimistic note, we were just talking about torture, which we have to. It is not an exaggeration. For people who, again, want to have the info now, we'll post the work of Linda McDonald and Jean Sarson. I also have a YouTube video summarizing some of the things that men can legally do to women, and it's called Sex Work. And these are just where's the sex? Like, there's not even, I mean, BDSM is one of the extreme BDSM is one of the controversial topics this podcast dives into. That's not popular, but needs to be talked about. I think a lot of people are very blue-eyed about what that means. They think it's just, handcuffs and blindfolds.
Yeah, feather tickling, right? Lots of furry handcuffs.
Despite the chance, we try to end on a little bit of an optimistic note. We're making this podcast because more people need to hear it, because it's not yet public knowledge of what's really going on. People prefer the cozy line of legal makes it safe, but that picture is slowly shattering. It definitely is over here in Germany. We really have increased critical reporting from the news media, which is so essential. Sometimes just one or two critical documentaries really burst the bubble. We have more and more survivors speaking out, which makes a huge difference. Writing blogs, writing books, making films, giving public talks, speaking to legislators. We have one of the biggest German parties, the Conservative Party, now in favor of the equality model, which we will also talk about what exactly the equality model entails in other episodes for those for whom that is new, that there's something other than prohibition and legalization. We also have prominent members of the Labour Party, not the party as a whole, but prominent members coming out. Just a week ago, this will probably date it when we go live, but another really prominent local municipal leader came out in favor. And a lot of these lawmakers see it in their own communities. When they actually sit down with women, they sit down with the communities and the survivors, they change their minds. They start really thinking about, what kind of society do we want to live in? Torture-free society, misogyny-free society, low violence. We're not saying we'll have utopia tomorrow, but these crimes should be rare. They should not be institutionalized and licensed and taxed. And that is not a crazy idea that just these two women on this podcast have. There is a major political endorsement from a lot of the Nordic countries, and increasingly the countries that have experimented with legalization and noticed, wow, we're just really enabling harm and we need to change. It'll still take some time, but I can say Germany will get the equality model in my lifetime.
That's wonderful. And we're so hoping for that. I know, like, so many abolitionists of the sex industry, that's really, like, I think our peak, maybe not our peak, but like it's the
domino.
Exactly. That is the moment that we have all said, when Germany gets the equality model, the game is going to change. Like, things are going to be different, because really Germany is the global brothel, and it really has been, I think the harms that have happened in Germany have been muted, because people like to say, well, decriminalization is the right approach. So what New Zealand has and parts of Australia, legalization, yeah, okay, that's a problem. But they're not really seeing that really the only big difference to that is, again, the taxation consideration.
The degree of regulation.
Exactly.
I mean, decriminalization is just low regulation, legalization.
Yeah.
You cannot have a prostitution industry with zero regulation. That's insane. And I mean, but even the pro sex work people don't necessarily support that. But we'll do episodes on that. I think we've promised about 10 episodes in this two-part episode.
Yeah.
And like I mentioned, I was involved in writing a report comparing Germany and New Zealand, and if you look closely, they're really very similar. Mm-hmm. So yeah, we don't consider that an alternative. It's just more of the same with some small differences. Mm-hmm. And the other thing that I really want to say positively, I mean, this is such a long fight ahead of us, but anyone listening who has experienced violence, whether you received money for it or not, really don't let anyone tell you it was your fault. Don't let anyone tell you if you'd been a little people smarter, more professional, discerning, whatever. Those people are full of shit. Like, nobody has those superpowers. Nobody can create a magic shield around them where no perpetrator ever gets through. This could happen to any of us. Inside and outside the sex trade, we know the rates of violence against women are high, and just really, no matter how much society tries to put the blame on the victim, there is still a man who had many, many, many indications to know that his behavior was not okay, at least questionable, who decided, you know what, I'm just going to do it anyway. It's on him. I mean, it's going way too slow. It feels like pushing up the most giant boulder of all time up a hill. But I mean, there is a movement out there fighting to end this victim blaming culture. Like the prostitution survivor Autumn Burris says, prostitution is Me Too on steroids. So anyone working against violence against women, migrant women's rights, homeless women's rights, all of those, if you can see prostitution for what it really is, then we have a real chance of making meaningful change in our lifetime. And then future generations can build on it.
Mm-hmm. So well said. Yeah, I didn't ever think that I would see the equality model introduced in Canada in my lifetime, because we are so neoliberal. And, right now, even though we've had it for 11 years, we're at grave risk of full decrim because there's so many people with money lobbying for that. But any country that adopts it is a win, even if it's in need of tweaking or, actual endorsement, more enforcement, all those things. Like, just getting it on the books is a statement in itself to say the act of using money or resources to coerce sex out of someone is an act of violence against them. That is, again, step one. Like, so many of these things are, even though the law we know doesn't stop a lot of people from, doing horrible things, it does set that tone for society to work off of. And we have seen a lot of progress over many decades in Sweden that has happened since they have rolled out that law, but also added a lot of educational, campaigns with it and stuff like that, which is, nothing like what we've done in Canada. There's been very, very little to actually even inform the public what the law is. But yeah, I like that statement. It's Me Too on steroids. And I actually had scribbled a little note as you were talking about wanting to mention the Me Too movement and saying, that was a good start. That was really, I think, kind of a turning point in society where we did start talking about sexual violence and the predation and, the rampant nature of it. But we never actually got to the point of including prostitution in that. So, the Me Too movement really neglected to consider that. And so, just because money is introduced doesn't change any of these things. And that's what I would say to women a lot of the times when I would speak to them. I would say, anything that is done to you in the prostitution system, stop and ask yourself, would this be okay if I sold cars for a living, if I worked at a shoe store, if I did any of those things? And if the answer is no, then the answer is the same for this, right? If we're going to treat it like a job like any other, then we have to look at it and say what's wrong in one place is wrong in the other. And the handover of money doesn't change that at all. Yeah, the harm is undeniable for those who actually look for it and are not deluded by money or by conditioning that we've had for so long telling them otherwise. And I don't really think I have much to add on to what you said, because you just so eloquently wrapped it all up for us. And, we really want to say to women, we are on your side. We don't want to instill further fear in you. We don't want to say that none of these things will help in some type of way, but we have to remember that, it's happening in a larger context of abuse. And, we just obviously, all of us want what's best for women, regardless of our political positions or anything that we have going on. But some of us, unfortunately, have that external voice or influence that has made us veer off of what is actually factual. So hopefully this episode has been insightful to you, the listener, to understand a little bit more why, this approach is wrong and it's really not effective for what our ultimate goal is, which is, parity between the sexes in society and safety in that regard. So we look forward to bringing more content to you. We are so appreciative of those who are listening in. Please check out the show notes for all the links of everything that we discussed. Please reach out to us with any comments or even questions that you have. You can find both Ellie and I on Twitter. My handle is @hindsight2020.
I'm at Ellie Arrow. That's ELLY, and arrow like bow and arrow.
Yeah, we're always available to interact on this topic. Obviously, it's something very close to our hearts. So thank you for your time, and we'll see you on the next episode.
We hope you found this episode informative. To follow us on social media, click the links in the show notes below. If there is a topic you would like us to cover, you can contact us at redlightexposé.podcast@gmail.com or head on over to our website, redlightexposé.com. There you can also find a donation page if you'd like to support the show. All the hosts at Red Light Exposé are volunteers, so we rely on your donations to continue to compensate our survivor guests and cover operative costs. Thank you for listening. We hope you tune in next time.